And joining us now in Washington, D.C., Evgeny Morozov, author of the Net Effect blog and contributing editor at Foreign Policy magazine. Evgeny, good to have you on the program this evening. We do want to sort of take a spin around the world and look at some of the major issues on the internet these days. And of course, the biggest one that so many people are talking about is Google threatening to pull out of China. It claims that people affiliated with the Chinese government are hacking into their systems. So let's start with this. Why would the Chinese government want to hack Google?
Well, I think it's not just about Google. It's about data that Google stores on some of its email servers, Gmail, which is a very popular email service that Google offers. And it just happens that a lot of dissidents around the world, including those in China and including those in Tibet, are using Gmail to communicate. And so far, the dominant theory is that the reason why the Chinese did so was to get hold of that data and those emails.
Well, do you think what's more accurate, that they're trying to get, hack into these Gmail accounts because they're in search of the algorithms, the so-called, secret technology that Google has? Or do you think Google's really more concerned about free speech in China? What are they more worried about here, protecting their brand or, in fact, free speech in China?
Well, I think it's all about corporate interests that Google has in China. In fact, as we see, months has gone by and nothing has actually changed. We have seen announcements this week that Google China is actually hiring more people to join the office. So they're definitely not pulling out as ambitiously as we would have thought. I think it's all about protecting their data and making sure that data on Gmail is secure. The freedom of expression issue is important, but so far there is very little connection. Even if Google does pull out of China, as long as it offers its email services, it will still be a very attractive target for attackers.
I think the hope was that access to the internet was expected to be a catalyst for a more open society in China. In your view, has it worked out that way?
Well, I think on certain issues, it definitely has. There has been campaigns on issues like the environment or women's rights, for example, where technology and text messaging have been used very effectively by social movements, which already were in place and which knew how to organize. In many other cases, we have seen the opposite, that the Chinese Communist Party learned how to use these technologies and this media to track what the dissidents are doing, to identify dissidents before they actually become dissidents, just by looking at what they're writing online, and to engage in things like cyber attacks, which exert a lot of psychological pressure on its targets. So far the record is mixed. I personally think that we have underestimated the downsides and overestimated what it could actually do politically.
Okay, let's broaden the discussion beyond China. I wonder if you could give us an example of another authoritarian country where the internet is actually helping to build a liberal democracy.
Well, there are certain countries like, again, Russia, or even the case of Iran, where the women's movement is very actively using new media to mobilize. Whether that leads to liberal democracy is a completely separate question. So yes, there are improvements for the civil society and for the NGOs and for the activists. There are definitely certain grounds which the governments have cited. Even in the case of, Russia, we do see, even though the civil society is very weak, activists on certain grounds which are favorable to the government are beginning to claim certain, certain benefits. On issues like corruption, for example, we do see Russian bloggers constantly challenging the government and trying to reveal, corruption in parts of the local government. And the federal government in Moscow is actually quite happy because eliminating corruption is also part of their agenda. Again, whether it strengthens the central regime and whether it somehow makes it more effective as opposed to undermining it and ushering in some kind of liberal democracy is a big question which we don't really know how to answer yet.
Any idea, Evgeny, why some online tools make a difference in one authoritarian country, but perhaps not at all in another authoritarian country?
Well, I think social and political conditions in certain countries make these tools more effective. So, for example, we can look at what happened in Egypt in 2008. when there was a very big Facebook movement, which somehow managed to unite with workers who were also organizing a protest, and they actually managed to work together very effectively. But that movement of workers was actually started before social media, and it existed very well before bloggers from Cairo joined that cause. So often we don't notice those less exciting, kind of boring traditional elements of social movements, and we tend to see only the new media angle, thinking that it's all about bloggers and it's all about tweets. Very often when it works, it's actually real people who've been doing this work for years and often for decades. And that's why every time the bloggers try to replicate such campaigns again next year, they fail if the social and political forces are not there. You know, and it actually happened in Egypt when people from Facebook, those who were campaigning there, actually tried to build a similar protest movement a year later, and it failed.
Now, of course, one of the great attractions to the internet in the West is that it is completely freewheeling and not at all controllable. It's quite the opposite in authoritarian countries, and I wonder if you could tell us what are the main ways that authoritarian regimes try to control the internet in their countries?
Well, traditionally, we have always thought about controlling the internet as a matter of censorship. So authoritarian governments would step in and block access to certain websites, and whenever you write something critical on your blog, on your website, they would then go after you, or they would go after the internet service provider which has published your writings. And this still exists. However, I also see several other kinds of censorship and control, I would even say, emerging. Some of them have to do with things like propaganda, where the government is actually paying bloggers to engage in discussions with its critics and try to discredit the critics by accusing them of being agents of the West, or by accusing them of being agents of the CIA. That actually happens quite a lot in China. There is an entire movement called the 50 Cent Party, which is supposedly trained and paid by the Chinese government to engage in those sensitive political discussions, which of course often also undermine online communities. Because if you expect to engage in meaningful dialogue with an author who wrote a blog post, and every time you come to that website, someone is discouraging him or criticizing him or accusing him of being a Western spy, those communities often disintegrate. So I would try to put things like propaganda on par with censorship, because we are seeing them playing a very important role in controlling the internet.
Now that's interesting, because I think the conventional wisdom is that the internet must be helping opposition forces in authoritarian countries. But of course, here are examples that you've just given of how the sort of entrenched regime uses the internet to their advantage. So who does, you've looked at it, who does the internet actually help more? The government or the opposition in these countries?
Well, what I noticed, first of all, is that many of these countries they defy these binary classifications into the state and the opposition. You know, in the case of Russia, in the case of China, even in the case of Iran, we see that those countries have a much richer and vibrant public life, which means that, you know, in Russia, it's not just the opposition you're dealing with, you're also dealing with nationalists, you know, religious extremists, people who just hate America, all of whom may also at the same time hate the government, right? But it doesn't mean that if they are also being empowered, we are moving any closer to liberal democracy. I think the best way to think about it is as amplification. So the internet does amplify a lot of these forces. Some of them happen to be more powerful, and some of them happen to use technology in more effective ways than others. But I would definitely say that it is amplifying all of the pre-existing forces that were operating in those societies. And it just happens that not all of them were either pro-government or, pro-democracy. There are many others, like Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, which is an active user of the internet. They just launched their own internal wiki a few weeks ago, where they try to gather history about their movement, which are not pro-Western, they're not pro-secular, but they're also extremely anti-government. And those are the kind of forces we also have to keep in mind.
Okay, fair enough, but let me follow up on one of the first things you said there, and that is there is I guess, many people in the West have this fervent hope that somehow the internet is going to open up authoritarian societies and help foster the blooming of democracy in these countries. Is that a realistic expectation for those people who feel that way?
I think it's actually not. I think we shouldn't prioritize the internet as a tool. We should try to integrate it in our other ways, and reforms of bringing democracy to those countries. It just doesn't happen that way. The parallel which often is drawn is between bloggers and dissidents in Soviet times, and between blogging and samizdat. Secretary Clinton here in the U.S. made that parallel herself when she was giving this big speech about a month ago. And I think this is not exactly the right comparison. Because we did think of dissidents in the Soviet Union as promoting a certain kind of democracy and being willing to go to prison and being willing to take the risks. In many cases, bloggers, yes, they also go to prison, but many of them do not take the risks, and many of them do not have the same courage, nor do they always want to bring in democracy. So I think we have to be really careful here and spend much more time thinking about opportunities for surveillance, opportunities for data mining, for violating privacy, which are now also possible through new media. And those are not the kind of things which you often hear when politicians talk about internet freedom. It's as if the internet is universally good and all the bad sides will somehow disappear. Well, they wouldn't.
Okay, a couple of minutes left before we invite our other guests to join their discussion and broaden it out. And finally, on U.S. policy in our one-on-one interview here. The U.S. government prevents domestic technology companies from exporting internet services to some authoritarian countries. And I'm wondering if you see any unintended consequences from this policy.
Well, certainly there are a lot of unintended consequences which actually thwart the ability of the U.S. U.S. diplomats and the U.S. State Department to promote internet freedom. It's so ironic that now we actually get editorials in Chinese newspapers which accuse the U.S. of blocking access of their own tools to Cuba. Which does sound very ironic. But there are a lot of downsides. With the one hand, we are trying to promote democracies through the internet, and with another hand, we are basically putting restrictions on how Iranians or the Chinese can download, not the Chinese, but Iranians and Cubans and Syrians, all of those states which have sanctions against them. We think that we shouldn't give them MSN Messenger, we shouldn't give them Skype, because somehow their leaders, who are all bad guys and are all authoritarians, would also use that technology. And of course, this raises many questions, and I think that undermines the credibility of American diplomats when they're trying to talk about internet freedom.
I can't help but notice that great symbol of the United States government just over your shoulder there in the background. And it prompts this final question from me in this part of the program. The Obama administration, I think it's fair to say, sees open government, transparent government as being one of the hallmarks of what they're trying to do in terms of changing government. So how does all of what you just said fit with the White House's overall diplomatic strategy?
Yes. Well, there are two elements here, and I'll try to be brief. On the first element, I think there are similar disappointments with how the open government movement failed to actually bring up cases of corruption. We understood that putting data online is not enough. Often bureaucrats have to spend more time explaining what the data means than actually digitizing it and putting it up online. So we have definitely understood that there are limits as to what you can accomplish with transparency. There is another domestic layer here, which is basically concerns about cybersecurity and cyber warfare. There is this pressure coming from FBI and Department of Homeland Security to actually start monitoring American networks to understand, how traffic flows, who is attacking us, what's going to happen in terms of cyber warfare. And again, that also limits the ability of American diplomats then to go and say, well, if you are the Chinese government or if you are the Iranian governments, you yourself shouldn't be looking at your networks. Well, we should, because we are concerned about cyber warfare. So that element is also beginning to play out, the tensions between national security domestically and foreign policy and freedom agenda internationally.
Okay, Evgeny, thanks for getting us started tonight.